Okay, so that's not what I wanted to show. But we are right here right now with the After Effects. So we're in this block of match motion. You know, we did kind of the first one last week where we talked about filming tips and introduced the camera. Now we're in this block, really the heart of our semester, where we're learning this process to be able to track cameras and reproduce those tracked camera results to solve a 3D camera to then place computer graphics into video footage. So today is really the beginning of that process. How do we solve a camera? And like I talked about last week, there's lots of different softwares that can do this. We'll be using After Effects because it's kind of the lowest hanging fruit and available easily to everybody. So After Effects is our first step. That's where we will track the camera. Next class, and we will bring that tracked camera or tracked cameras. We'll do a couple different scenarios today so you can familiarize yourself with different footages and different challenges, green screen footage, on location footage. We'll do a variation, or at least I'll do a variation up here. If you have your own footage, you're welcome to use that. Although, if problems pop up, I can't solve it right away because I'm not working on the same footage. But if you don't have footage, I dropped a link a little bit ago into the Discord. There's about 1 gigabyte worth of files there that I will be using. There's like 4 or 5 different scenarios in there that we'll be going over. So grab those files if you don't have your own, or if you want to just follow along to familiarize yourself with the process. So after we track the camera in After Effects, we are essentially creating a 3D representation of where that camera was in real-world 3D space. Remember, when we photograph something or we shoot it for video, we're taking the 3D world, 3-dimensional space, depth, or X, Y, and Z, 3-dimensional space in this room, and converting it down into 2 dimensions. Photograph's a flat thing, right? A video is a flat surface. We have to re-expand that 2-dimensional image back into 3D. That's what allows us to solve for the 3D camera. After Effects not being a 3D software, we then will have to take that camera into Cinema 4D or Maya. There's ways to bring it into other softwares too, but we're not going to cover all of them in depth. I think our go-to for ease will be using Cinema to do this. Historically, we've used Maya to do this. I'm more of a Maya person myself, but like I've explained in prior classes, the plugin unfortunately hasn't been updated for more recent versions of After Effects and Maya. So to save everybody the hassle of installing Maya and After Effects 2019 and 2020, we're going to do it with Cinema instead. If you can figure out the process using other softwares, go for it. Kudos to you. Then after we have turned that tracked camera into a 3D camera, which is pretty much all we're using the 3D softwares for. We're not doing 3D modeling in here. We're not doing, rigging or any sort of stuff like that. I'm happy to answer questions about that if you have your own questions, but that's not something that that's not really the point of this class. After we have the 3D camera, then we can export that and import it into Unreal Engine. Okay. So that's kind of the next couple weeks here. And really the most important part of the semester. So this is a fairly tedious process. It's the same thing every time, pretty much. But if you get one step wrong, everything falls apart really quickly. And when I say falls apart, I don't mean like explode dramatically. I mean that your graphics just kind of don't really move with your video. It just doesn't look like they're stuck to the surface as the video moves around, which is devastating if you're trying to make it look like it's all in the same shot. So in addition to those files that I gave you, that zip file that I gave you to download, I also want to show you a really useful website HollywoodCameraWork.com, and they have all sorts of different VFX plates, green screen, and tracking plates that you can freely download and to mess around with if you don't have your own. For example, in the downloads here are some of the green screen plates that they have. We'll be using this one today, actually. A little low resolution there, but camera on a track moving around. You can see the tracking marks on the ground. There's quite a few different ones here. So if you're looking for more different scenarios to play around with, this one's pretty fun. Well, that's the end result, but tracked camera, put this person inside of 3D graphics. If you follow all the steps, doing something like this is not outside the realm of possibility. So, useful website if you're just looking for footage and stuff. There's also other things here as well. Tracking plates if you want to practice at doing different types of tracking, planar tracking and object tracking, that sort of stuff. It's more just a repository for footage, though. It's not really like a tutorial site or anything like that. So you kind of need to know what you're doing with the footages. Okay. Let's open up After Effects. All right, so I'm just going to bring in all of the footage that I gave you today. Try to unzip my folder here, just the AE tracking folder. There's a lot of different stuff in here. I have included some checkerboards and some grids and some test patterns. I like to use those just as reference to make sure things are aligned properly. So I'm just going to import this whole darn folder. You know what, let's just do one at a time. Let's start out with an outdoor shot. Plenty of tracking marks, no problem whatsoever. There shouldn't be a problem. Lots of things for the camera to latch onto. With green screen, if I can find that example here. With green screen, if you don't have enough tracking marks, you don't have any tracking marks at all. If there was no tracking marks here, the software would be like, what do you want me to do with this? I can't do anything. If you gave me a featureless green screen, I would be able to track the marks on the person there, but that wouldn't allow us to solve for the camera movement. Why would the tracking marks on the person not necessarily allow us to solve for the camera movement? The camera's still moving around them. What about them being a human being is problematic? Although she does a good job of it here. We move, right? Yeah. The background's not moving unless you have like a fabric green screen or something like that and a wind machine going. That could be a problematic too. That's something we didn't talk about, but like fabric green screens, they're really cheap solutions for green screens. You can get cheap fabric for big areas for pretty cheap. But one of the potential problems with that is that it can blow really easily. And if it's wiggling around even a little bit, that can throw your track off. I guess that could happen with paper too. But just something to think about. Now, she does a pretty good job holding still in this example, so we might still be able to track the camera. We'd have to test it. We're not going to test it today, but we'd have to test it. But the point is that we want tracking marks on the green screen. For our first example, we're just going to use an outdoor scene. So this is something that I just shot for fun a long time ago. I told her we were going to put giant pumpkins around her. And I did. I'll have to dig up the final to show you the end result, but lots of grass and dirt on the ground to track, not to mention the plants in the background, the wall, all sorts of stuff. It's a fairly busy scene, even though it's just dirt and grass. After Effects is going to have no problem tracking something like this. So let's go ahead and do it. When the camera tracking works, it's pretty simple. So first thing I want you to do is we just need to create a composition for our footage. So I have the video footage or the image sequence as a layer in my composition. And then I'm going to go over to the tracker panel and I'm going to click Track Camera. That's going to create the 3D camera tracker plugin, or not plugin, but effect. As soon as I click that, you see stuff starts happening. This blue bar pops up. Over on the left in the effects panel, we get the effect, 3D camera tracker, and it starts chewing through this footage. It says 20 seconds remaining. Now, how long this takes is going to depend on how complex your footage is, how long it is, the resolution of it, all that sort of stuff. But not long at all. So you see there it said solving camera really quickly there at the end and put up a little orange bar. That moment right there, when that pops up and that disappears, that's good. You should breathe a sigh of relief. You didn't get the dreaded red bar of doom that says camera solve failed, because that's when it could happen. And that's the most vulnerable moment of this entire process. So if I zoom in here, see all these little colorful rainbow colored X's all over everything. And if I drag my mouse over, you see I get like a weird triangle that pops up between points, and also I have this bullseye target that kind of snaps to the different triangles. That's all good. If you've gotten to this point and you can see something like this, you should feel pretty darn good. Now, one special note that you should know. We're working with video footage. So just like when we were talking about keying out our green screen footage, what looks good one frame might not necessarily look good at another frame, right? So always scrub through your footage just to make sure that the points are sticking. If I hit play, it won't, all the points disappear. So I'm just dragging. Make sure the points kind of stick. And if you don't have a lot of points at one portion of your video footage, maybe scroll to another part where there is more tracking marks on the ground. Okay? And that should allow you to still solve things. If your points are ever really teeny tiny, like they kind of are here, you can adjust the size of those things with the target point size and target size. Target size is the size of the red target, and track point size is the size of the little colorful tracking marks. So I'm just going to make them big so you can see. You see sometimes they pop up, sometimes they disappear. That's absolutely fine. So if we were using a different tracking software where we had to do manual tracking, you would see it's very common that a tracking mark does not exist for the entire duration of the video. If I have a camera and I'm filming something, perhaps it goes around the corner and I don't see that little point anymore that I'm tracking. That's okay. As long as I have enough points that I've tracked throughout the duration of the video and enough coverage, if they disappear for some parts of the footage, that's fine. I just need to make sure that I compensate. That if one point disappears, I have another point that kind of takes over and hands off as the camera moves around. So them popping in and disappearing, not a big deal. You can also see there's a lot of tracking marks on her. That's fine as well. Sometimes that can be a problem if you are shooting on green screen. After Effects is not that smart of a program. It only does what we tell it to. So on green screen, the software has a tendency to lock onto the subject, the human being in this case, because they're wearing clothing that isn't flat green. They're a fairly recognizable thing that has a lot of tracking marks on them, right? Or a lot of features to track. That can be a problem because then the software will want to track them rather than the environment. In an outdoor scene, there's so many more features to track that is rarely a problem. If something like that ever becomes a problem for you, you could potentially mask them out. So put a hole where the person is, because we're not tracking the person, we're tracking the environment. I had an example of that in one of these slides from last week. Yeah, here we go. This guy was talking about his scene. He's probably waving his arms around. Could be a problem to track this. So what's the solution? Mask that dude out. Have the software track the background, and then fill him back in after you're done doing the camera track. He doesn't need to go away forever. He just needs to go away when we do the camera track. So sometimes you need to do that. Most times you don't. And more times this happens on green screen than an outdoor scene like this. All right, so that's a lot of explanation. Let's continue to do something here. So I'm going to lower down my track point size just a little bit so they're not so enormous. And all I'm going to do is just hold down left click. This is not an exact science. This is a trial and error thing. It really depends on your footage. It depends on your own capabilities. It depends on your own comfort level. I'm just going to lasso up a bunch of ground features. Not her feet. So I'm going to unlasso those in a second. Do I need to lasso up this many? No, not really. But what I'm doing by selecting all these is I'm saying these points are on the ground. They are on the floor. These are at, zero. Y is 0 on a mathematical graph, right? Y is 0, or in Unreal, I guess Z is height. So Z is 0. So I let go of this, and look at that. Looks like I have a target that is fairly aligned with the ground. As soon as I scrub, that disappears and I have to do it again, but I'm just showing you. So by selecting all of these, I am getting an average of all of those points. If I just select these ones right here, I'm just getting an average of those points. And actually, look, the target is kind of crooked a little bit. Why is it crooked? Probably because a big piece of dirt is crooked there too, right? That's a problem with this ground, is this isn't the street out there. Well, I guess the streets aren't necessarily perfectly smooth either. But in this case, the dirt is all kind of roughed up and stuff, so there's different heights that we're dealing with. Do you need to worry about something like that? Sometimes. Just depends on how precise that you're trying to be. In this case, doing an average, you can see right away, it's a little crooked, right? If I did a greater average of all these points, I'm losing fidelity a little bit. Like precision, I guess I'm losing. But at the same time, I'm just kind of more closely in the ballpark as far as setting the floor. So I might not be at the highest point of where the dirt tops out at. I might be not at the lowest point. I'm just somewhere right in the middle. So where you drag this selection is going to be a trial and error thing for you. You just kind of have to see what works. It's not an exact science. So after you have a selection that you are somewhat happy with, you can go ahead and right-click on it. And you're going to get a menu. Fortunately, it won't let me zoom in right now. But you're going to get a menu with a lot of options. First option that we want to do is set ground plane and origin. So the ground plane is going to be flat and parallel to where the target is. The target is going to sit on the ground plane. The ground plane is the floor. The ground plane is 0. Okay? And we're also setting the origin. So the origin is going to be the center of that target. That's going to be 0, 0, 0. in 3D space. If you want to move that target around, the reason that it's positioned here is because there's more tracking marks weighted over on the right side. If I selected less on the right side, it would probably position it more towards her feet. Is that a problem? Not really. I mean, you can adjust in 3D space. You can move objects around once we have the camera solved. So I'm going to go ahead and set ground plane and origin. Nothing appears to happen. It's by design, I suppose. And then go ahead and create a solid and a camera. You could create text in a camera. You could create null in a camera. It's going to achieve the same thing. I just like to create a solid because it solves me one step. So create a solid and a camera. Ta-da! So down here, switch my mouse. Down here, I have a 3D camera tracker, or a 3D tracker camera created. And I have a lovely magenta solid created. That magenta solid is aligned to where that target was. If I play this now, or if I scrub this, it looks like that is stuck to the floor. Maybe I want to scale this up a little bit just to see it. Maybe I will lower down the opacity a little bit so I can see through it. And I'll just go ahead and play it. Success. If you've gotten to this step, congratulations. You've done step 1 of a 1,000-step process. But the most important step, it's not really 1,000 steps. Step 1 and the most important step. If you go and do all the other steps, it doesn't matter if your square is not sticking to the floor. You might as well give up and start over if you can't get this, because it's not going to get better. It's only going to get worse. And you're wasting your own time. So if it's not stuck to the floor, couple problems it could be. You didn't select points that made sense. The software couldn't detect points that made sense. The 3D camera tracker gave you an error and you didn't even get to select points. That could be because your footage doesn't have enough features in it. You didn't put enough tracking marks on the green screen. The person is moving around too much and the software is focused on them, so maybe you need to mask it out. Maybe you need to increase the disk catch folder. That's just me. But if you do get to this point, you should feel pretty good about things. Any questions so far? You can see it sticks to the ground. The perspective shifts as the camera moves. If I was to cut out a big pink square and have laid it on the ground in person, it would pretty much look like this. Now again, we might have the problem where the dirt is a little higher in certain parts. Can you get away with that when we move into 3D? That's another problem that we'll deal with when we have to. But I think for the most part, you all will probably have video footage that has flat surfaces. I think for the most part. Maybe not. Maybe everybody's going to go out and do like, I don't know, ground planes that are like all hills and stuff. But I feel pretty good about this. It's magic, right? It's amazing. So the difference between this sort of tracking and something like planar tracking, which you may have done before, I don't know, maybe you've had like your phone or something, right? And you put a green screen on your phone with tracking marks. You don't really need to put tracking marks on your phone because you use the corners of the phone. Those are tracking marks. But in that case, you don't really need to solve for the camera because you're just sticking a graphic to the phone. That's called planar tracking rather than camera tracking. Camera tracking is tracking the movement of the camera around the 3D world. Planar tracking is sticking a graphic to a planar flat surface a plane. Different types of tracking for different needs. Okay. Just to make this a little bit more obvious, I'm going to go ahead and do some things. We're not diving into 3D today, so we can just leverage After Effects' 2.5D. I also have these grids and stuff that I like to play around with, just to test to make sure everything is working and looking aligned and things. I'm going to import these 3 graphics because I'll be using them a couple times today. So this solid's here. I know that that's already aligned to my target and everything. So I'm just going to duplicate it. So I have a second one. Because I'm going to replace this pink solid with my checkerboard. My checkerboard I'm going to blow out to the size of the floor. It'll help me visualize to make sure that my movement of my camera is really synced up with my camera track. So a little pro tip here. If you don't know how to easily swap out layers in After Effects with something that is in your project window, what I want to do is I want to swap out this duplicate solid that I just made with my checkerboard, right? You can do this easily if you grab onto the thing that you want to use to replace, you hold down the Alt or Option key on your keyboard, and you drop it on top. It swaps out the one graphic with the other graphic. This has nothing to do with 3D. This is just a swapping layers in After Effects thing, but a useful thing to know in this class or any time that you're doing anything in After Effects. I'm going to turn off the other pink solid, and I'm going to mess around with the rotation on this and kind of line things up. I'm going to rotate it a little bit. Do you need to do these steps? No, I'm just showing you this so you can really see that it is synced up and aligned properly. After you get comfortable with things, you can just export the camera over to Cinema 4D and then bring it right into Unreal and feel good to go. I'm going to scale this up a little bit. Rotate it a little bit. Now I'm just rotating and scaling. I'm not translating it in space at all. So I should still see it stuck to the ground, right? If I started translating it around on the Z or X or Y axes, I might screw things up. But here you can see, that's the grid on the ground. Sort of like that graphic that was in our slides last week. What's that at? Yeah, this thing. Now, if I wanted to move this on the x-axis, this is still aligned. This is still sitting on the floor. I'm just moving it on the x-axis. So it's not going to become misaligned. Even when the camera jitters there a little bit, it still picks that up. If I move this back on the y-axis, maybe through that wall in the background, perhaps I want to rotoscope that wall out and put, I don't know, a giant haunted house back there or something. I could do that. The grid is still aligned. Let me move it on the x-axis a little bit. The grid is still aligned, even though it's actually off camera. It's through that building. You know, it's as if the building wasn't there. It's an infinite plane that stretches out in the X and Y directions. Let me move that back to where it was. If I move this up on the Z-axis here, I gotta be careful because I can mess things up really quickly. Right now, if I look at the position of my checkerboard in After Effects, it's 0, 0, 0, right? When I was moving it around, I was changing the X and Y axes. If I move this up on the Z axis, it's no longer sitting on the floor. This is bisecting her body somewhere around her neck area right now. Now, if I wanted to place, I don't know, little flying witches on broomsticks, because 'tis the season. If I wanted to have them kind of floating around her and flying at neck level, this would be my reference point for my ground. But then if I wanted to go back and place something on the ground, well, I wouldn't know where it is anymore because I just moved my reference point off of the ground. So be careful when you start to translate things away from 3D space as you're working. When we move into Cinema 4D next week, I will show you how to bring your solids over so you can keep those reference points and we can bring those all the way over into Unreal. Let me undo that so it's back on the ground. Good to go. You know, sometimes what I'll do, because I'm a paranoid person, is I'll keep my original solid and I will render out this footage with the solid baked into the video footage, and I will bring that into Cinema, make sure it's all aligned there, and then I'll bring that into Unreal and make sure all the graphics are aligned there too. Like the actual 3D solid is sitting on top of that pink square. So there's nothing left to chance. It's all good to go. It's not going to be a problem in this case, but something to keep in mind too. If we're stepping through multiple softwares to do this pipeline. There's a lot of potential points of failure, right? One really easy point of failure is if your frame rate changes between those softwares. This was something that happened very easily with Maya, not so easily with our current pipeline with Cinema, but it would instantly cause problems. And the problem is that the native frame rate in After Effects for this footage specifically just happened to be 30 frames a second. Okay. For whatever reason, Maya wanted to change it to 24. You might think, oh, it's not a big deal. 30, 24, who cares? Big fucking deal. The biggest of deals. Because your video footage would be playing at its native frame rate, in this case 30 frames a second, whereas Maya or whatever 3D program would be playing the 3D graphic on top of the little purple square here at 24 frames a second. So it would get misaligned. It would start out good. You would look at frame 0 and be like, oh yeah, this looks good. But as soon as you hit play, you would see that it would gradually get more and more out of sync. So frame rate differences, you could mess that up going from After Effects to your 3D program. You can mess that up going from your 3D program to Unreal. You can mess that up 2 times, among other things that you can mess up. But that's a very common thing, a very common problem that crops up where people are like, oh no, my thing's out of sync. It starts out good, but then it doesn't end up good. It's probably your frame rate. Amongst 1,000 other problems that can happen. Okay. So I feel pretty good about this. This is good. I could go and I could actually, if I wanted to build a little 3D room here, I could. A 2.5D room, I suppose. Rotate this 90 degrees. Whoops. Push this back. I'm just having fun now. Like if After Effects was if we were building 2D After Effects worlds, this is where I could just stop and have some fun with the camera checker. So notice that those two surfaces are kind of sliding against each other. It's because the vertical surface right now is not abutted to the edge of the floor. I could do that though. And I just show you this as a demonstration so you can familiarize yourself with the 3D space. I'm just kind of eyeballing this right now. Wow, this is way off. It's not perfect. I'm not going to do the math in my head right now, but now there's no parallax. So let me low down the transparency on those, or the opacity on those. Actually, let me move the wall up so we don't get double vision. There we go. So can you start to see the 3D world assembling itself once we have the camera solved? In our case in Unreal, these won't be flat surfaces like they are in After Effects placed in three-dimensional space, but they'll actually be real 3D objects. It'll be so much more compelling. But this is After Effects. This is all we can do. If you aren't that familiar with After Effects, you can actually see a 3D view in After Effects by changing these little buttons down here. The active camera, and currently it says one view. It's just like in Unreal, you know how we have our perspective view and our top view and our bottom view and all those different views. We can get those in After Effects too, if you wanted. If that was useful to you. Check it out. Here's this right view here. Let me switch over to single view and go to my right view. There's the 3D camera sliding through space. Let me look at a top view. Unfortunately, it disappears when I play it, but if I scrub, see the camera moving through 3D space. This was just a handheld camera. Nothing fancy. So after this, next step would be to take this over into Cinema. Convert what we just did, turn that into an FBX file that has the 3D camera in it, perhaps keep our placeholder surfaces, if that was useful to us, to use for alignment purposes in Unreal, and then we export that over or import that into Unreal once we have our 3D file. So as far as After Effects goes, our job here is finished. Show the what?
The crack solid part.
The pink one?
Yeah. Just before the pink one, when you freeze the whole part, you're getting this.
Oh, you want to see the whole process again?
Not the whole process, just
all right, because I only show it once, and then you got to do your final projects. I only show it once. I'm sorry. What did you want?
like after you put the crack points, and then from that, how you get the crack solid? That
Oh, how did I get the track solid? Right. So you just select the points that you want, whichever those points may be. You let go, and it will look like this. We haven't saved it yet, so then you want to right-click. You want to go to Set Ground Plane and Origin. That sets the floor as the floor, and also puts 0, 0, 0 at the center of that target. And then this, I'm not going to do it because I already have a camera. But after I click this menu will disappear. You right-click again, and then you can go to Create Solid, and that will put, your color might be different, but that will put the solid, the square solid on the floor. Mm-hmm. And then all I did to get the other stuff, I just replaced that solid with other graphics. Sometimes what I'll do, especially on green screen, is green screen's a lot more obvious with the tracking marks because they will actually just be where you literally put the tracking marks on the green screen. They're not going to be in the empty space where it's green and there's no physical tracking mark that you lay down, unless maybe your green screen's really dirty or something, or has rips in it. In that case, what I like to do sometimes, I'll put this grid on there for my own reference, or even just the solid, and I'll try to line it up to the tracking marks, right? So if I had, whoops. If I have my green screen and I have tracking mark, tracking mark. Imagine this is like a top-down view. What I'll do with my solid in After Effects is I'll try to align it somehow with my tracking marks. So as it moves, I want to make sure that it stays on those edges, It becomes very obvious if it starts to float around in that case. In a real world example like this with on location footage, you can't really do that. Well, I suppose you could put artificial tracking marks into the real world if you wanted to. That would be fine. Of course, then you got to remove those. Rotoscoping and stuff. Man, this little, for the record, this little desk sucks. There's nowhere to put my mouse. There's like a little fold-out drawer that I was using. Like, there's no room on this tray. Right. Thanks, NYU. They tried, right? Anyways. Any other questions before we do another scenario? Oh no, did I break my mouse? Shit. Kind of. Well, that sucks. NYU owes me a mouse. Okay. Let's do another scenario. Actually, you know what? Let me try to find the final of this real quick, just so you can see before we move on. Drive. Might not be able to find it right away. I'll find it during break then. Okay. Well, let's do another scenario then. I'm going to save this just so we can return to it. And I'm going to look at a different piece of footage. Really did bust my mouse. I have to push really hard on the left mouse button now. It's unfortunate. So here's a messy scene. I'm just going to track the floor here. I guess I could track anything, Do I want to put something on the table? Do I want to put something on the chair? That brings up a good point. What should you track? Well, I guess it depends on where you want to put your 3D graphics, right? If I track the floor, I won't necessarily know how high up that table is, right? So I need to track the surface that I want to stick the graphic to. I could estimate, but it's the best case scenario that you track the surface. You track the ground. The ground is the surface that you're placing it on. So, is it the chair? Is it this table over here? Is it this table? There's a lot of garbage on this table, but you could still track it. So I'm going to create a new comp for this. On the tracker, same thing that we did before. Track camera. Can you stabilize before you track? Sure. You could stabilize it. Just do that first. Don't track it and then stabilize it. Because then you tracked the unstabilized footage and then you stabilized it. What are you doing? No. You got to track the footage that you're actually using, whether that's stabilized or not. So I'm going to click Track Camera, let this process. It's a little bit more busy of a scene, so it might take slightly longer. Ten seconds. Solving camera. Success. Make those track points a little bit bigger so you can see them. Render track points. There we go. If you wanted the track points to be on when you hit play, you can toggle the little render track points checkbox there, and then they'll stay on when you actually play it instead of just scrubbing. See, the points disappear a lot here. They popping off all over the place. There's actually a split second there where they all disappeared. Right? It didn't happen that time. Maybe just After Effects. But you see all the surfaces there. Look at the wheels on the dolly over here, on the chair points, on the dolly, on the table. A lot of surfaces that we could track. I'm just going to do the floor again. So lasso this up. If you lasso up your points, the target should look like it's laying on the floor. If it doesn't look like it's laying on the floor, select better points. Okay? Don't go through with the process if this doesn't look good. Right click, set ground plane and origin. Right click, create solid in camera. Boom. Done again. So this could bring up an interesting thing where, what if, we're just in After Effects right now, but what if I wanted to, I wanted to put a 3D graphic behind this chair or something like that. Well, right now, it's just on top of everything. So in that case, I have to do some rotoscoping like we went over a couple weeks ago. So I could select that, put the chair back on top, and I could get my roto brush. I'm just going to do this really quick. Let it process out. And when we bring this into Unreal, we will be rendering out foreground and background plates, so you might not necessarily have to roto something out. But just showing you from a traditional VFX standpoint, now I have the chair by itself, combining that with the original footage by itself. That all comes together, and now the red square is behind the chair, except for the little handle on the chair. I missed that part. But you can start to see how you can start to sandwich things together. So if you had real world on location footage like this, and you wanted to put a 3D graphic in this room, what should we put in the room? A giant Pikachu or something like that. Giant 3D Pikachu. Stick it right in that room where the red square is. Well, I want it to look like it's actually in the room, so I need to put those foreground elements in front of it, right? Like the chair and stuff, like I just did. So I'm going to have to rotoscope that stuff out in post-production after I'm finished in Unreal and I bring it back to After Effects. I'm going to have to create an artificial real-world foreground to place in front of that. Otherwise, Pikachu is just going to be on top of all the video footage, right? It's not going to look like it's sandwiched in between. So that is just a really quick and dirty example right there. You know, on green screen, you don't really have to worry about that because there is no foreground elements. Well, sometimes there could be foreground elements. I guess if you were creating like a set on green screen where you had foreground elements that were practical effects, they were real props that you were placing on the green screen, and then you were just introducing a CG background on green screen, then you might have to key it out or rotoscope it out to get a foreground element. But in this case, not on green screen, any foreground that you need to create, you're going to have to rotoscope it. Luckily, the chair was very easy to do. So that's another example. It's sticking to the ground right there very well. Any questions about that? Well, you all are experts now, huh? We can just wrap it up, I guess. All right, let's see what other footage we got here. We got a green screen. Got my grids already. Yeah, we can go ahead and do the green screen one. Import. New comp from selection. So this camera happened to be on a track, on a dolly for the smooth camera movement. You see that there's elements on set that are in camera that are not green screen. I don't think it's going to be a problem in this case, but it could be a problem where those things are negatively affecting your camera track. If they are negatively affecting your camera track, you just mask them out. Right? Use what's called a garbage mat, where you mask out the garbage. That's why it's called a garbage mat. Get rid of the garbage with a mask in After Effects. You can see that over here, especially in this corner, up top, there's like lights and stuff. For this case, there's enough tracking information on the floor that we don't really have to do that. But there could be a case where maybe you don't put enough tracking marks down that it becomes a problem. Okay. Same thing. Put your footage in a composition, camera tracker, track camera. Let that process out. You see the green screen tracking marks here. They're just green gaff tape, like what I showed you downstairs last week. You can use anything to be a tracking mark. Just think about the work that you're going to have to do to remove that tracking mark. The fact that it's green here makes our lives a lot easier. We'll probably be able to just key it out like we can with the whole green screen background. If that was a different color, it would be a lot more of a hassle. Not so much the tracking marks that are down here because they don't cross over her, but the tracking marks behind her body, I might have to potentially rotoscope out those tracking marks, which, rotoscoping, a lot more work. So notice that the tracking marks here are really tiny. So depending on what After Effects decides, it may make those points really tiny, it might make them really large. Adjusting the size over here is not just a visual cue to allow classes at NYU to be able to see the marks better. We're actually multiplying the world space by whatever percentage that I increase over here. Sometimes what happens, and this is not just for this shot, sometimes what this happens is that because we're using After Effects, we don't really have a lot of control over the actual physical dimension of our space. So like this shot right here, I don't know how big this room is. Let's take a guess. And it's like 8 feet wide by 7 feet tall. Let's say 8 feet wide, 8 feet tall, and maybe like 12 or 15 feet long at this point. At no point do we enter those values into this software. So After Effects kind of arbitrarily fills in the values when it creates the 3D camera. And what this means for us, not necessarily a problem today in this case, but you can see, and this will probably happen to some of you when you bring it over into Unreal or even into your 3D program, you may see that everything is either really teeny tiny or really gigantic. It's always funny in this class. This happened a lot more with Maya. Students would bring over their tracked scenes into Unreal, and you know the avatar for the camera in Unreal, right? The camera icon. Everybody's camera tracks fit within the lens hood of the camera icon in Unreal. That's how teeny tiny they were. They all were so small, like our entire camera tracks. Even if we move the camera all around this room, they just all got scaled down, which is fine if you work really teeny tiny, but that has problems as well. So you have to scale that up potentially after the fact. We'll talk about that more next week when we actually move into the 3D program and see it being a problem. But I can show you how to scale the entire world. It's important how you scale it because you want everything to scale uniformly. You don't want to scale the camera independently of the tracking marks on the floor. You want to have all that stuff almost be parented together. Well, we will parent it together in Cinema 4D with a null object, and then we'll scale the null object so it all scales up together. So, a little bit of an academic thing right now, but if that ever becomes a problem for someone where your world is just really weirdly scaled based off of the real place that you shot the footage in, you can scale it afterwards. You can also scale it in Unreal too. Anyways, so our green screen example here. Notice that I don't have a lot of tracking marks on the floor at this point. There's a lot on the ceiling. There's a lot on the side here. There's a lot where there's high contrast features to track. The tracking marks on the green screen here, they're there, but they're not as high contrast as like the TV over here. But as I scrub the footage a little bit forward, then I get all these markers on the floor. So in this case, because the camera is not moving up or down, it's just translating on the track around the room on the x-axis and the y-axis, I can get away with just solving for the camera for the points halfway through my footage. I don't have enough points here to solve for the floor, confidently solve for the floor. I suppose I could just use these 3, but some of these are from her feet. She does hold very still here, so you could probably get away with using her as an actual tracking mark. But in this case, the tracking mark is not on the bottom of her foot. It's actually, up her foot a little bit. So the tracking mark that I use on the ground, this is flush to the floor, but this is not flush to the floor. So it's actually going to be tilted up a little bit, which you might not think is a big deal. But the farther back in 3D space that you would place an object, that little tiny difference is eventually going to become an enormous difference if you're making this world really big, right? It's just going to keep compounding itself potentially. So it's very important for you to use marks that are all planar on the same planar surface. So in that case, I wouldn't want to use her feet. And if she was moving, yeah, forget about it. You can't use it at all if she's moving. At least for camera tracking. If you're doing object tracking, that's a different story. All right, so I got some points here. You see all these points are flush to the tracking marks. See, there's actually a couple for most tracking marks. At least 2 for most of them. Oh, we got 3 right here. It's up to you to decide which ones you want to use. If you just wanted to use these 4 here, that's fine. If you wanted to select more, it doesn't really matter, because in this case the floor is perfectly flat, or at least I assume it's flat when they built the building. So you could get away with using less than outdoors. In that last shot that we did with all the dirt, I wanted to select more because I kind of wanted to split the difference between all those mounds of dirt. All right, so same thing. Set right click, set ground plane, right click, create solid. Play this out. Looks good. You know what? I'm actually going to do I don't know if I'm capable of screwing this up. I'm going to try to screw this up on purpose. When you're that good, folks, you just can't screw it up. I'm kidding. So I'm going to select some points on her foot, and I'm going to select some points on the ground. Set ground plane and origin. Create solid in camera. Now, at first glance, this might seem fine. And maybe you can get away with it. Again, it's visual effects. So if you don't notice and they don't notice, then who cares, right? If the trickery fools everyone, then who cares if it's, oh my gosh, gasp, you tracked her ankle instead of the floor? You better not do that. If nobody notices, who cares? I'm just going to try to screw this up, but I don't know if can you tell that that square gets a little closer to the tracking mark on the floor? It looks like it floats, it gravitates towards it a tiny bit. Does anybody notice that? No? Maybe let's do it with her other ankle to make it a little bit more obvious. Oops. Set ground plane. Set solid in camera. Again, I'm trying to intentionally screw it up here. Oh, this one's a little bit more obvious. Maybe. Yeah, on that tracking mark right there. This is also a demonstration with how much I'll allow you to get away with. So this looks okay, but when I play it, see it kind of shimmers. Oops. Get in a position where you can actually see the whole darn thing. Sorry. You see it kind of shake over top of the tracking mark? And actually then it puts a gap in between it too. It's very subtle. I'm failing at making a bad example here. But that could potentially be very noticeable depending on what sort of environment you're trying to build. If you want it to look like she's standing right on the edge of a cliff, that's a dramatic, harsh edge of a 3D graphic, right? And if she's kind of like hovering out over it a little bit and it's shaking, that's going to be very noticeable, potentially. If she's in the middle of, I don't know, a grass field or something like that, you could probably get away with a lot more because there's less actual reference points for people to compare against. Let me try to screw this up one more time a little bit better. Let me just, I'll select this point here. And then I'll just go up on the wall. Not that point. There we go. So this isn't necessarily wrong. It's only wrong if you want to place something on the floor. If you want to place something at an arbitrary angle that slices through her body and connects that point on the wall with that point on the floor, then it's not wrong. But I don't know why you would want to do that. Set ground plane, set solid and camera. So now it should look like this surface is actually floating in air. And you can see that the points are occluded, parallax effect as we slide through it. It looks like it's floating. You can also get that floating if you establish the ground plane and then you just move your 3D object up off the ground. Then it will look like it's floating, and you'll appropriately have it having established the ground. In this case, this is only going to look good if I'm trying to put something at a weird angle in the room, because now I don't know where my ground is. I've said that my ground is parallel to this red shape, right? So if I want to go into the room and, I don't know, try to put this on the floor, let's say, sure, this is the floor. Let's try to rotate it to the floor. Let me try to scale it up so it's touching those points. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to mask it. So you'll see how the alignment is really off. So I'll mask it on that dot, and that edge, and that edge, and that edge, that edge. So this looks good at this frame, but if I go over here, it's not attached to this marker anymore. So all that's because I didn't appropriately establish my ground, and everything's off. You can't really fudge it if it's off. You really need to establish a good ground plane. Then everything else will easily fall into place. Let me undo that, delete that, delete that. Let's go back to delete the camera again. If you just want to start over, you need to delete all the solids, and you need to delete the camera too, because the camera is the thing that actually is being created through this tracking process. And your points won't pop back up till you actually click on the effect. So when you click on the effect, all the points will pop back up, and I can do everything over again. Oops. All right, so let's do it correctly again. Here, select, oops, not her foot. Select this, select ground, right click, set ground plane, set origin, create solid and camera, good. I'm gonna scale this solid up. And it bisects through that wall, that's absolutely fine. And I'm gonna try to do that opacity again, and we'll see how good my track actually is. Let's check it out. Pretty good. Not perfect. And that disparity comes from me having selected points halfway through the footage. But it's okay. Really depends on the type of background that you're putting the person onto. If it's like a busy floor, you can get away with a lot more stuff than if you're trying to put them on like a clean checkerboard 3D surface where, the edges of the lines, if they shimmy a little bit and overlap the person's feet, it's very obvious. If it's more of like an abstract, busy floor, you can get away with a lot more. Let me untrack that or unmask that and introduce our grid again, or our checkerboard. Let me rotate this to follow the perspective of the room a little bit better. Scale it down. So when we move into the 3D programs, we'll be able to actually place 3D objects in 3D space and get all the benefits of that with the perspective shifts and everything. Because After Effects is a 2.5D program, I can fake that with flat planes, but it's not going to be as exciting as an actual 3D object. So if I start putting other sorts of surfaces in my environment, duplicate that floor again because that's my reference point. I'm going to scale that back down to 100. I'm going to replace that with the test screen here. I'm going to rotate up the test screen so it's sitting on the floor. Go to my rotation. Now, a good question is how far do we have to move it up? Do you just guess? I don't know. How would you determine how far I have to move this up? Just guess. You guys are the worst. Looks good enough. Well, where's the graphic cut in half right now? At the top? At the bottom? No, right in the middle, right? So if I knew the dimensions of this object, I could divide the height in two and know that, oh, this graphic is 1080 pixels tall. What's half of 1080? 540, right? So if I move this up 540, it should be perfectly aligned on the grid. And look, I eyeballed it. Now I'm going to go down and actually look at the number. 526. Good enough, folks? You think that's good enough? We put in 540 in there. Remember, good enough won't actually make it look like it's stuck to the floor. If actually, let's move it on top of that edge right there. Start to build a little house for her here. You can start to encapsulate her into the 3D world. In this case, I could rotoscope her out if I wanted to. I'm not using the 3D camera checker. Oh. It gave me that error because I duplicated my footage rather than bringing in a clean one, and it had the 3D camera tracker on it. I don't want to use the 3D camera tracker because I'm just going to rotoscope her out separately. That's why it gave me that error. Momentary panic. I'm going to try to do this with my broken mouse. This is quite low footage, low resolution compressed footage, and my broken mouse. And probably good enough for now. I could have just keyed her out. That just occurred to me. Why am I rotoscoping? I must really hate myself. Okay, so now I have her kind of separated. Obviously, it needs work. Move this one up, actually, or I'll duplicate it and move it up. Whoa, didn't intend on moving all of them. That's fine. That's all right. I move those foreground elements in front of her. And they're not stacked on top of each other anymore, but starting to place in 3D space. Perhaps this interests you and you just want to put a bunch of flat videos all around a person, and I don't know, maybe they're doing like some weird like Minority Report style gestural computing where they're swiping things away and hitting menus and stuff like that. After Effects would be a place for you to do something like that, assuming that there was no 3D in the graphics and they were just like flat motion graphics style effects. We did it, folks. We did it. I feel good about it. And y'all are experts now too, so you should feel good about it. So go and do it. Your assignment is going to be to go and do it on a green screen and on some sort of on-location footage, just to get familiar with the process. So for your assignment, and we'll talk about this again at the end of class, but for your assignment, you shoot something. If you really can't shoot it yourself, then it's fine if you just find footage. You're going through the same process. But come up with some sort of footage that you want to spend some time with for the next couple weeks, because we'll be using the same footage in After Effects, in the 3D program, then in Unreal. Okay, so if you don't like your footage, well, find something that you like, because we'll be using it for 2 more weeks. Any questions about this?
Yes, just one question.
Sure.
Other than use art to drag all the powerful stuff into the conversation, is there any other ways just normally drag those things into a conversation and apply the same?
The same.
Yeah.
Sure. So in that case, what you would have to do, and let's try to do it, you basically just would have to copy the position and the orientation from the reference point to your thing that you just brought in. So in this case, let's make this a little meta, maybe. Where is that? Oh, there it is. So if I just bring this in, the original footage in, well, it covers everything up, obviously. But now this is a 2D layer on top of a 3D tracked scene, right? Which is not what we want. The layer that I just brought in isn't deforming based off of the camera movement. It has no 3D orientation whatsoever. The reason for that is because it's not even a 3D layer. So this little icon right here on the right, the little box, notice how these ones are checked on all of these other layers for the different test screens. If I went and I made that box checked, okay, it positions itself down there. And now it kind of looks like it's in the room, but its orientation is all weird because it's actually through the floor, and I don't really know where it's placed. You could look in the 3D view here. Let's try to locate it here. This could be tricky because things can be really far away. You put me on the spot here. Now, if I look in the top view, oh, check this out. This is really cool, actually. In the top view, oops, in the top view, here's my camera, the little red thing moving around. And all those other layers, like this big square right here is the floor. These are some of those other layers that I dropped in there. Kind of see a top-down orientation of my 3D room that I just made. Now that layer that I just dropped in there, it's just sitting right in the middle of the room. If I looked at this from the front or the side, zoom out here, you can see this right here, this long line on top here, that's my floor, right? And then these squares on top, these squares and rectangles up here, those are those different shapes that I placed in the room, the test pattern, right? So you can kind of start to see the 3D placed together. Now that footage that I just brought in, that's below the floor, right? It's down here. So if I dragged it up, this is where I think After Effects really starts to fall apart in terms of 3D. If I dragged it up, I go back to my camera. Look at this now. Now it looks better. Now it looks like it's actually sitting on the floor. It's not perfect because I didn't zoom in and spend a lot of time with it. But now it actually looks more part of the room. So that's kind of eyeballing it. It's not perfect. A better way to do that would be to use the reference point of the floor. So remember, the very first thing we did when we made the solid, and then I changed it to a checkerboard just to make it a checkerboard because I love checkerboards. I could use the reference point of the checkerboard to bring that in. Now the position is 0, 0, 0. That doesn't really help me too much. I could make the position of that video footage, I could make that 0, 0, 0. But remember, the middle of the video footage is actually going to be located at 0. This footage is 1080p, so I need to make this 540. Oops. Make this negative 540. Again, now it looks like it's somewhat aligned with the floor. Not quite. The orientation, the X and these ones 0. It's a little bit better. It's not as easy as if you just replace the layers, because you're going to have to manually go in and enter all those values. You can do it, but you need to really wrap your head around, like, okay, that one is positioned at 0, 0, 0. It's also a little rotated. You're going to have to copy those numbers over. You're almost best just using the alt, click, drag method.
Thank you.
You could also, and you know when we right-clicked on it, and let's see if I can get that back. When we right-clicked on it after selecting, the points, oh no, stop doing that. Yeah, after selecting the points, I right-clicked on it. Instead of a solid, you could create a null, and that would be a similar sort of thing. It's just it would be a little bit less, there'd be less information graphically for you to, it wouldn't look like a flat square placed on the ground, which I happen to like. because it looks like it's a piece of paper laying on the ground. If it was a null, it would be the same idea. It would give you the rotational data and the location data that you need. It wouldn't look like a flat square on the ground. So you could do that instead. When we bring it over into Cinema 4D, we'll mess around with the null objects as placeholders in 3D space for things that we can stick other graphics to. But to answer your question, you just need to copy the values. Like if we made it the floor has, let's look at its values. So these are the values for the floor. I scaled it way the hell up just so it was bigger. But it's position 0, 0, 0. Why is it 0, 0, 0? Because I told the target to be the origin, right? So that's why it's 0, 0, 0. The most important thing here, though, is the orientation. How is it oriented to the floor? Those are the values that you would need to copy over. The position and the orientation. If you do those things, then it should be exactly the same. But you have to do that manually. I suppose you could parent it too, but more steps. And there's a lot of different ways to do the same sort of a thing. Any other questions? Last chance to ask. The entire semester.
For an outdoor scene, like when you show that the subject is moving, we can mask the person out and get the tracking done. But what if by chance, if there's things moving in the background of the subject, so everything needs to be masked out, or how does that work?
Like if you went down on the street,
Yeah.
You just tell everybody to hold still. Listen up! Well, that might be a bad thing to do. Yelling, listen up in a crowded space. Yeah, good question. In that case, I would probably try to I wouldn't discourage you from recording that footage. I would just try to find a way that we could mask that footage. Like if there's people moving in the background, can we just isolate that footage where I can just get the ground, right? Or is there a part where the people are moving over here? There seems to be a lot, but there's a little area over here I can use. Or maybe you just track it and it just works, which is also quite likely. If they're in the distance, I don't think it's going to cause a problem 9 times out of 10. It only really causes a problem on green screen, or if they're up in the foreground and they're taking up a good chunk of the frame. That's when the tracker gets confused. And again, I'm just talking about After Effects. If you're using a real professional tracker, you're usually not using the auto tracker. You're usually doing manual tracking. So you are going in, you are saying, that little spot on the ground, track that. That little thing over here, track that. It's not even taking into account any of the people because you didn't tell it to take into any of the people, right? So this tracker in After Effects is an auto tracker. We can't manually say, track this and not that. Maybe a little bit by masking out, we can say, take this out of the equation. But real trackers, you manually assign the whole darn thing. I don't know if I could... Might get myself into trouble here. But let's see if I could pull this up real quick. I'm going to just pull up Remote Desktop on my other computer. Try to launch Buju here, which is Vicon's tracking program. Let's see if I have something here. I don't know if these are going to open. These are just recently used, so let's try it. Oh no, you can't locate the file. Well, that one's not going to work. Recently used. Will these ones work? Close project. Put me on the spot. Potential for failure is high. So in this case, for this footage, there were no tracking marks. It's actually not a lot of floor either. So full disclosure, I could not get this to track in After Effects. It would not work. So I had to do it manually. Let me see if I can find my manual tracking points here. So this is kind of a cool look behind the scenes here. My keyboard, there we go. So here you can actually see the tracking marks in 3D space. They're aligned on the wall. These ones right here happen to correspond with her, right? So this was more tricky because I had to go in manually, and for some reason that's not saved. I was trying to show you my manual tracking marks, but for some reason that's not saved in this file. I don't know why. Let's see if I can find it real quick. If not, we'll just abandon this. Well, that's a bum out. That took me a lot of time to manually do, and for some reason it's not saved. Because this is the auto track right here, which is basically what After Effects is doing. But if I wanted to manually track, see if I can do this remotely. Oops. Let's say, what do I want to do here? Let's say track, just find something, track this, I guess. Track. You see that little green dot that's tracking that? That little crease in the background? I would do that a lot of times. You do that enough times, eventually the software will be able to solve for the camera. That's manual tracking, where you would have to go in and manually decide, that's the point I want tracked, which you can't really do with After Effects, but you can do with some of the more professional softwares where you need that nuanced control. So in that case, the people in the background wouldn't matter at all because you're the one deciding. This program also can do auto tracking just like After Effects does, where the software decides the points. Does that answer your question? Not really?
Yeah.
Okay. When we started that journey, I knew exactly what I wanted to do, and the longer it went on, I was like, am I telling him the answer that he wants to hear? Any other questions? Last time. No? Okay. Let's take a break, and I want to show you not really any more demo, unless it's to answer a question, but just some end result examples, what our goal is, and what we can do with these footages, maybe a couple breakdowns, and then have some time to allow you to work through it in class. Not too long, but just use some of the class time to work through any sort of bugs that anybody's having in class, because this is such a critical step. Again, if we can't do this step, we can't do anything else. So this is the most important thing, the camera tracking here. All right, let's take a break. We'll just come back at 4. So we've talked about step 1 today, tracking our footage, solving for the 3D camera, whether it's shot on green screen, whether it's shot on location. I wanted to look at this footage again in a different software just because it's a little bit, it has a more neat 3D view, so you can see how actually everything's aligned. So nothing new here. Everything's tracked already. See this ladybug. The ladybug is Buju's logo, so I don't know why, but that's just what their logo is. Obviously, it's in front of her here when it should be behind because she's not rotoscoped out. But what I really wanted to show you was just the 3D view, so you can really visualize all of these points in 3D space. And when we track our footage, whether it's in After Effects or this software or whatever, we're trying to determine the ground plane. The ground plane is this grid, right? It's what we can set things on top of. It's what we know, all right, the orientation of the floor or whatever I'm putting this object on, the CG object on, this is where it is located in 3D space. In the case of this shot, you see all these points right here on the ground. They're sitting on the floor, generally sitting on the floor. They're close. Again, remember the dirt, it has peaks and valleys, so it's a little all over the place. You see these green dots right here. These correspond to the ones that are selected here. Actually do side-by-side view. Again, I'm not showing you this to use Buju so much as it's just a little bit more of an obvious behind-the-scenes peek at things rather than After Effects. So, you know, these ones over here on these plants in 3D space, those are actually located over on the left side. You know, this view right here with this box, this yellow box right here, is our camera. You're looking into the scene. The dots on the left correspond with the plants on the left. The ones in the distance, the far distance against the building, in 3D space, those ones are far in the back. And that's what camera solving does, is it takes these dots right here and it turns it into this. This is what camera solving does. It extracts the 3D depth information from a two-dimensional source, the video. How does it do that? We talked a little bit about that last week. Tracking the features, doing parallax, comparing between frames, sort of like how photogrammetry does. That's how it's able to extract the positional data for X, Y, and Z for every single point, also rotational data. And eventually, with the magic of software, we end up with something like this. And then we can go in and place 3D ladybugs or cubes or giant Pikachus or whatever the heck we want to end up doing. For some reason, I couldn't find the final video of this that I made, which is slightly concerning to me. But I did find this cropped vertical version of it. Just giant pumpkins. And color grading and stuff. Just brought back into After Effects and recomposited together. What?
Are these pumpkins really on it, or is it from that model?
No, they're 3D models. They are. I'm glad you think they look so real that they could be real. I think it's just this pumpkin, actually. In Quixel Megascans. Oh, it's going to make me want to sign in, but yeah, I think that's where it's from. It's just a Megascans pumpkin. And maybe some Megascans plants, too. Actually, I'm not sure where the plants came from. It's from a long time ago. Yeah. You know, other things that you eventually can think about. Again, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but Let me find a good angle. I want to find the horizontal version of this at some point in the future. But also, we're introducing the pumpkins into this scene, the foliage into the scene. We're rotoscoping her out so we can put graphics behind her. We also might want to introduce, in this case, actually create fake dirt with CG, because maybe the pumpkins, their weight of the pumpkins have nestled them down, and as they've grown over their lifespan, it's rained, it's wind, they've settled into the dirt, right? And if we want to make them actually look like they're part of it, we want the dirt to come up in front of the pumpkins and kind of smear on the edges to make it actually look like they're nestled in there, right? If we didn't do that, they're just going to look like they're sitting on top of the graphic, and it's going to look that less realistic, Another thing that you might want to consider for this particular image, let's see if I can get this, jumping between a few different computers here. Close that down. Let's switch back to this one. Turn off the checkerboards. I really wanted to find the After Effects file that showed it all put together, or the Unreal file, but I can't. I tried. Gave myself an extra 5 minutes for break 2, but I couldn't do it. You might want to rotoscope out or mask out some of these mounds of dirt so they actually go in front of the pumpkins, so it actually feels like they're sitting within there. And all sorts of little tricks that we can use. Unfortunately, the vertical version does not do it justice. Let me show. Also wanted to show another example. Sorry, folks. She's the star of the show, so she's going to be in every example that I show. So for this one, I've shown it before. The cats come and jump into the scene. So that's the original footage. This was tracked in After Effects, not even using fancy Buju for this, just After Effects. So there's all the tracking marks. The ground plane was created. The end result. Let's see if I can get the end result. The end result. Oh, I forgot to take those tracking marks off. Of course, untoggling means that the rotoscope needs to repropagate. Let's go ahead and do that. So this was tracked in After Effects, brought over into Maya. This was from a few years ago when that plugin worked, and then brought into Unreal. And I'll try to show you the Unreal scene. It's really slow right now, unfortunately. This is really slow as well. Turn off some of these elements. So here was just a layer of the background cat. It's rendered out, the ones that are behind her. And then here is, I haven't looked in this file in a while. I think one of these is her leg that is covering up the background cats. It's just her leg. A disembodied pink leg. Because it only needs to cover up where the cat is being covered up in the background. So you don't need to rotoscope out her full body, because her arms, there's nothing behind. There's no CG behind. So it's a waste of time to rotoscope out. Where are the foreground cats? That's not them. There. So all the other ones, you can see the camera movement. It looks weird after they're stripped away from their background. Movement really looks strange. So the cat's there with their shadows. So foreground element, background element, original video footage, perhaps color grading. There was some grain added to this, all re-put back together from CG elements that were rendered out of Unreal. I'm going to close After Effects down because it's really slowing things down and try to look at Unreal. This might be too slow to look at. Not sure that's a bunch of cat butts, apparently. This might just be too slow to look at. I'm not entirely sure why I'm getting 2 frames a second. Oh, okay. I think it was just some of my masks. Remember I told you sometimes your scenes are really tiny and they fit within the lens hood of the camera? That was the case in this, and I just didn't bother to scale it up. So this is the scene. And if I open my sequencer, a lot of different animations for the cats here. These are all just marketplace assets for the cats. Let me hit the G key. And they're just all toggled to come in at the appropriate times. And then separated out. Exported to After Effects as an EXR image sequence. These little toggles here in Unreal, this is Unreal Engine 4 this was made with. But these little toggles over here that I'm clicking on that are slowing everything down, this is the composure compositing system in Unreal. This is what we are leading up to using here in Unreal. Unfortunately, it doesn't want to cooperate with me right now. This is what allows us to separate out background elements, and well, here you can see it a little bit. It's laggy, but let me open this up. So composure in Unreal allows us to not have to use fake green screens to place on flat planes in Unreal. We can tell Unreal, these objects, you are foreground elements. These ones back here, these are background elements, and it will already isolate them like what we see here. This is what we're leading up to. And then we can render this out separately. Then you can render out, this wants to cooperate. Well, we could do the background separately too. It's too slow, so I can't show you. And then reintroduce the original video footage as well. All that compositing done in post-production in After Effects or Resolve if you're comfortable with Resolve. You could render it all out from Unreal if you wanted to and just call it a day. It's just you have a little less nuanced control because Unreal is, yes, it can do compositing, but it can't really do like specific masking of things, and specific color grading. It's just not what it's made for. So you lose all of those nuanced controls. You're doing live compositing in Unreal would be something that you would have to use Unreal for. If we wanted to have a live variety show that we stream onto Twitch for this class, that would all have to be composited live in real time in Unreal, pumped up to the internet. Oh, there we go. Element not running. Yeah, there's the background cats. Too slow to scroll through sequencer though. If I scrolled through sequencer, you would see them all move individually. And the black is transparency, so when that's rendered out, they just come in separately. So when we get to that stuff, I'll show you more examples of projects and we'll actually learn composure, but that's That's a number of weeks from now. Where is that at? Well, not too many weeks, actually. No, October 20th. 2 weeks. So all coming together. What else? I kind of think that's most of what I wanted to show you. Hopefully you can track your cameras. I want to see you do it with your own footage. Not that my footage was anything special. It's pretty ordinary stuff, you know. Most of that was shot on, I don't remember. The one with the cats on the street was shot with just like a Sony A7V III, and the one with the pumpkins was shot with the black. No, that was also shot with a Sony camera. So just a DSLR. I don't think that there would be any reason that that couldn't have been done even with cell phone footage. Obviously, last week I talked so much shit about cell phones and how not to use that, but you know, I think we could have probably got pretty close using the phone too. But you know, obviously the hardware starts to work against you at a certain point, especially on green screen. Yeah. Any questions about any of that? Yeah.
What's your opinion on the iPhone 15 ProRes?
I mean, it's a good codec at least, but do you have ultimate control over focus? Do you have ultimate control over exposure? I know there's some apps that allow you to have more control of those things. You can like remotely rack the focus and stuff. If you're doing that, then I think it can get close to a better camera situation. But I would also say that people that are probably doing that know better, you know, so they're probably not using the phone to begin with, unless there's some sort of technical reason, like, you know, this is a run and gun shoot, you know, we're going to be shooting on the subway and we don't want the cops to stop us. Then it makes sense to shoot, you know, something, a small device like that, because cops like, oh, it's just a phone. You know, who cares? It's not like a big rig and stuff. Not that DSLRs are huge, but you know, just it's this different feeling, you know. So I mean, ultimately it's whatever works. I think the ProRes situation, it's not going to necessarily solve motion blur or exposure unless you're using some of those apps, but at least you would have a better codec to work with for color grading. But again, the codec almost matters more for green screen than out on the street or something, you know, unless you're doing severe color grading. The codec, like if that, you know, if this was shot with MP4 cell phone footage, like it'd make no difference, the codec, because it's still going to be able to track it because the resolution is going to be able to be the same. If this was green screen, then yeah, it would be a problem. A lot of my wife has a side business. She has an enormous food blog. I'm going to retire from it because that's where all of our money comes from. No joke. And she just shoots everything with like a Pixel phone, an Android Pixel phone. But we use an app that allows us to shoot like raw for a cell phone, you know, rather than the default camera app, and it works fine. Why do we use that? Because every time I try to get her to use, like, oh, we're gonna get the Blackmagic 6K and we're gonna rig it up, we're gonna do all these things, and she's just like, dude, stop! I can't move all this shit by myself. Like, it's just a phone that's attached to a grip arm, and it's easy. You know, I don't want to. I have to have you there if you have this huge camera system. So, you know, there's bounds of reason for other reasons besides I need the best quality. Like, if you physically can't move the camera and it's a pain in the ass and you're not going to shoot because of it, then just shoot with it, whatever. You know?
And, so like for like rotoscoping and stuff, where does the benefit come from that? Is it like resolution then? Or?
Oh, that's a good point. The rotoscoping, I would say, I mean, the codec and the color sampling and the bit depth on those sorts of things, all that stuff we talked about last week, you're definitely going to benefit more with the green screen rotoscoping than even something like this. I think in terms of rotoscoping, if it's real world footage on location like that, I think resolution might be more useful in that case because it will get all the nuances and stuff. But at the same time, rotoscoping real world footage is more forgiving than green screen because, I mean, it's on a real world background, you know? And if something passes behind her, it's only for a split second, perhaps, and then nobody notices, you know? It only has to look good for a second. If you're pulling somebody off of a green screen, it needs to look good all the time. You know, it's a lot more work. Yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question? Those are good questions. These are like real good, real world questions that I don't have specific answers for because it really depends on the footage. I mean, in a perfect world, we'd all be shooting with red cameras that weigh as much as your cell phone and, you know, the highest quality, but that's just not a practical thing. You know, not everybody can do that. And I, like last class, I didn't want to use that to discourage you from shooting, like to think, oh, I can't do anything because I don't have the fanciest camera, blah, blah, blah. No, don't do that. I built my entire career on shooting HD footage on a 5D Mark II with MP4s, or I guess it was an MOV footage that was just H.264. And I showed you how crunchy it was, the hair example, the side-by-side when I got the Blackmagic camera, and it was like, holy shit, there's something better. But at the time, it was fine. It's all I could afford, and it was good enough, you know? There's always better tools. It's what you do with the tools, right? And I know in this very technical class, I don't want to lose sight of the creative, and we do have to learn all of these processes, but at the end of the day, we just want to make cool stuff, you know? And try not to get bogged down by the technicals, even though there are a lot. That's why I'm the nerd and my wife is the creative director. I just do what she tells me to do. Oh, we should really use this other camera with this other lens. It will give us the zoom. And dude, just shut up. You know, I'm recording this right now, so I can play this back to her, and she can hear all these lovely things that I'm saying. Hi. Any other questions? I like those questions. Those are real world questions that I almost feel like are more useful to suck my brain information out as someone that works in this industry and does this stuff and is used to confronting these difficult questions that you don't even know are problems until they pop up. You know, I am more happy talking about those things than demoing things that you can almost just watch a tutorial video on. You know, like somebody else could show you how to use 3D camera tracker. Maybe somebody else can't tell you, you know, a detailed answer about what codec to use in this sort of scenario. So, you know, I'm absolutely happy to answer those sorts of questions, and I would prefer it. It's more interesting for me too. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, I just wanted to use the rest of the class time as workshop time. You're not required to stay for workshop time, but don't come crying to me if you can't figure it out and you left. I have him taking a mental note of everybody that leaves and then comes afterwards and is like, I can't get it to work. Bro, you should have stayed. All right. Next week, we will take this into Cinema 4D. So if you can come to class, if you're following along on your computer, if you come to class with C4D, if you want to get the full version, you can as a student. You can do that. You don't have to get that. Cinema 4D comes bundled with After Effects. A light version of it comes bundled with After Effects, and we can use that instead of the full version if you don't want to get the full version. We're not really going to be using any of the full version features. We're just using like a tiny portion of Cinema 4D, literally just to export our camera as an FBX file. That's it. Okay. Yeah.
I see see the longitude is like pretty no longer continued. Is that like the matter? You still like,
No. I have to mute this. I have to pause this now.